Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Memory is not a gift, but a burden. Not the preservation of experience, but its prolongation. Not the recording of the past, but its endless present tense replay. And this replay is what makes trauma permanent, what makes suffering extend beyond its moment, what converts a single event into a lifetime of pain, because the event is not just remembered, but is relived. It is re-experienced in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of activation that do not distinguish between then and now, between memory and occurrence, between representation and reality, and so the past remains present, remains active, remains capable of causing suffering long after the original threat has passed, long after the danger is over, long after any adaptive function of remembering could be served. And this persistence raises the question of whether some memories should be erased, whether some experiences should be forgotten, whether the technology that is emerging, that promises to selectively delete traumatic memories while leaving other memories intact, should be used, should be embraced, should be offered to those whose lives are destroyed by memories. They cannot escape, cannot integrate, cannot survive, and the survival is what is at stake, is what makes the question urgent. Because some memories are incompatible with living, are producing symptoms that are unbearable, are creating suffering so severe that the person carrying the memory would choose non-existence over continued remembering. And the choices being made is visible in suicide rates, in substance abuse, in all the ways that people try to escape memories that will not let them go. And the letting go is what forgetting would provide, is what erasure would accomplish, is the liberation from the past that therapy tries to achieve, but often fails to deliver. Because therapy works with memory, works through memory, tries to integrate the traumatic experience into narrative, into meaning, into the story of the self. But some experiences resist integration, resist meaning, resist becoming part of any story except the story of horror, of violation, of the destruction of everything that makes life livable. And when integration fails, when meaning cannot be found, when the memory remains as intrusive, as overwhelming, as fragmenting as it was at the moment of encoding, then what is the ethical response? Is it to insist that the person continue carrying the memory, continue suffering from it, continue being destroyed by it? Or is it to offer erasure, to provide the technology that could remove the memory, could delete the trace, could free the person from the past? And the freedom is what erasure promises, is what makes it appealing, is what drives the development of techniques that can target specific memories, that can identify the neural patterns associated with traumatic experiences and disrupt them, prevent them from reconsolidating, make them inaccessible. And the inaccessibility is forgetting, is the functional equivalent of the memory never having been formed. And if the memory was never formed, then the trauma never happened. Not in the sense that the event did not occur, but in the sense that it is not remembered, is not present, is not continuing to shape experience. And the shaping is what memory does, is how the past influences the present. And if the influence is removed, then the past is effectively erased, is no longer part of the person's life, is no longer determining their responses, their possibilities, their sense of who they are, and the who they are is the problem, is the question that erasure raises, because if identity is constituted by memory, if the self is the narrative constructed from experiences, then what happens to identity when memories are deleted, when experiences are removed, when the continuity is broken? And the continuity is what makes the self feel stable, feel coherent, feel like the same person over time. And if memories are erased, then the person who emerges is not the same person, is someone different, is someone who did not have those experiences, who was not shaped by that trauma, who does not carry that pain. And this difference is what makes erasure controversial, is what raises the ethical question of whether it is right to change someone's identity, to make them into someone else, even if that someone else would suffer less, would function better, would have a life that is livable, because the life that is livable is not the life of the person who chose erasure, is the life of a different person, a person who is created by the deletion of memory. And creation through deletion is strange, is unsettling, is raising questions about what it means to be the same person, what continuity consists of, what identity requires, and the requirements are not clear, are disputed, are the subject of philosophical debate that has no resolution, because some theories say that identity requires psychological continuity, requires that there be a chain of memories connecting present self to past self, and if that chain is broken, if memories are deleted, then continuity is lost, identity is disrupted. The person who exists after erasure is not the same person who existed before, and this non-sameness is either a problem or a solution depending on perspective, depending on whether identity is valued more than well-being, whether continuity is more important than happiness, whether the integrity of the self matters more than the quality of experience, and the quality of experience is what suffers under traumatic memory, is what is destroyed by intrusive recollections, is what makes life unbearable for those who cannot forget. And if they cannot forget naturally, then perhaps they should be allowed to forget artificially, to choose erasure, to opt for the deletion of memories that are destroying them. And the destruction is real, is measurable, is visible in brain scans, in stress hormone levels, in all the biomarkers of chronic suffering. And the suffering is not ennobling, is not making people stronger, is not serving any purpose except to demonstrate that memory can be prison, can be torture, can be the mechanism through which the past destroys the present. And the destruction is what erasure would prevent, is what deletion would stop, is what forgetting would accomplish. And the accomplishing is mercy, is compassion, is the recognition that some memories are too heavy to carry, are too painful to bear, are incompatible with survival, and survival is what matters, is what should be prioritized, is what justifies intervention, justifies technology, justifies the manipulation of memory that would once have been considered impossible, unthinkable, unethical, but is now possible, is now real, is now raising questions that must be answered, about who decides, about what criteria are used, about whether erasure should be available to anyone who wants it, or only to those whose suffering meets some threshold. And the threshold is where the difficulty lies, is where the ethics become complicated, because if erasure is available only for the most severe trauma, then who decides what counts as severe enough? And if it is available to anyone, then what prevents its misuse? What prevents people from erasing memories that are uncomfortable but not traumatic, that are painful but not disabling, that are part of the normal range of human experience and should perhaps be integrated rather than deleted? And the integration is what traditional approaches emphasize, is what therapy aims for, is the incorporation of difficult experiences into a coherent narrative, into a sense of self that includes the trauma but is not defined by it. But this incorporation is not always possible, is not always achievable, is requiring resources and time and capacity that not everyone has. And even when it is achieved, it is not always sufficient, is not always eliminating the suffering, is not always making the memory tolerable. And when integration fails, then what? Is the person simply condemned to suffer? Condemned to carry the memory forever? Condemned to be destroyed by an experience that happened once but is replaying endlessly? And the endless is what memory makes possible, is the way that a single event can become a lifetime of suffering. And if that suffering can be prevented, can be eliminated, can be stopped through the deletion of memory, then why should it not be? What principle is more important than the relief of suffering? What value trumps the well-being of the person who is being destroyed by memory? And the destruction is not metaphorical, is literal, is the disintegration of functioning, of relationships, of the capacity to live. And if erasure can prevent this disintegration, then perhaps it should be used. Perhaps it should be offered. Perhaps it should be normalized rather than stigmatized. But the stigma is real, is coming from multiple directions, from those who believe that memory is essential to identity and should not be tampered with, from those who worry about slippery slopes and unintended consequences, from those who insist that suffering has meaning and should be endured rather than erased. And the meaning is what is most disputed, is what is most questioned. Because the claim that suffering has meaning is easy to make from a position of safety, from a position of not suffering, from a position of having integrated one's own traumas, or never having experienced trauma severe enough to be unintegrable. But for those who are suffering, for those who are being destroyed, the meaning is not visible, is not accessible, is not providing any comfort or purpose or reason to continue. And the continue is what is in question, is what is at stake, is why erasure might be necessary, might be ethical, might be the right choice. Despite all the concerns about identity and continuity and the sanctity of memory, because memory is not sacred, is not inherently valuable, is only valuable insofar as it serves life. And when it does not serve life, when it destroys life, when it makes life unbearable, then its value is negative, is harmful, is justifying intervention. And intervention is what erasure is the technological manipulation of memory for therapeutic purposes. And the therapeutic is what justifies it, is what makes it ethical, is the goal of reducing suffering, of improving functioning, of making life livable for those for whom it is currently unlivable. And the unlivable is the condition that justifies extreme measures, that justifies technologies that would otherwise be considered too risky, too invasive, too potentially harmful, because the harm of doing nothing is greater than the harm of erasure, is greater than the risk of identity disruption, is greater than any abstract concern about the sanctity of memory. And the sanctity is the appeal to tradition, is the insistence that things should be done the way they have always been done, that memory should not be manipulated, that the past should be accepted rather than edited. But this traditionalism is not serving those who are suffering, is not helping those who are being destroyed, is only protecting an ideal, a concept, a belief that memory is essential to being human. And maybe it is, maybe memory is what makes humans human, but maybe humans would be better off with less memory, with more forgetting, with the capacity to let go of experiences that serve no purpose except to create suffering. And the capacity is what technology is providing, is what erasure makes possible, is the choice to forget, to let go, to be free from the past, and the freedom is what matters, is what should be prioritized, is what makes erasure not just permissible, but perhaps obligatory, perhaps something that should be offered, should be encouraged, should be made available to all who need it, because the need is great, is widespread, is affecting millions who are living with memories they cannot escape, cannot integrate, cannot survive. And the survival is what is at stake, is what makes this an urgent question. Not an abstract philosophical puzzle, but a practical ethical dilemma with real consequences for real people who are suffering now. who need relief now, who cannot wait for therapy to work or for time to heal or for meaning to emerge from their trauma. Because for many, the meaning never emerges. The healing never happens. The suffering never ends, except through death or erasure. And if erasure can prevent death, then it is the ethical choice, is the compassionate choice, is the choice that prioritizes the person over the principle, the individual over the ideal, the actual suffering over the abstract concern. And the concern about identity is legitimate, is real, is raising important questions about what continuity means and whether it can be preserved through erasure. But these questions are secondary to the question of survival, are less urgent than the question of whether the person can continue living with the memory. And if they cannot, then the questions about identity become moot, become irrelevant, because identity requires existence, and existence requires tolerability, and tolerability requires that memory not be destroying the person. And if it is destroying the person, then erasure is justified, is necessary, is the intervention that should be used. And the using is not a failure of courage or resilience or meaning-making, is not an admission of weakness, is not a refusal to integrate or endure, is simply the recognition that some experiences are too much, are beyond what can be borne, are incompatible with living. And when living is the goal, then erasure is the means, is the technology that makes it possible, is the mercy that medicine can provide, and the providing is ethics, is compassion, is the appropriate response to suffering that is otherwise unrelievable. And the unrelievable is what makes memory torture in some cases, is what makes the past a prison, is what makes forgetting not a failure, but a necessity, not a loss, but a gain, not the destruction of identity, but its salvation, because identity requires a living person, and living requires that trauma not be replaying constantly, not be fragmenting consciousness, not be making every moment unbearable. And the unbearable is what memory makes possible, is what remembering produces, is the cost of consciousness that includes memory. And maybe some things should not be remembered, should not be preserved, should not be allowed to continue shaping experience. And the shaping is what memory does, is how the past influences the present. And if that influence is destructive, then it should be stopped, should be interrupted, should be erased. And the erasing is what technology now allows, is what ethics should permit, is what compassion demands. Because the alternative is continued suffering, is the ongoing destruction of people by their own memories, is the insistence that they carry burdens that no one should have to carry, that serve no purpose, that make no meaning, that produce only pain, and the pain is enough, is sufficient reason to intervene, is justification for erasure, for deletion, for the right to forget, for the mercy of amnesia, for the liberation from memory that is prison, that is torture. That is the mechanism through which trauma becomes permanent. And the permanent is what should be ended, is what technology can end, is what ethics should permit ending. Because memory is not sacred, identity is not absolute, continuity is not more important than survival, and survival is what erasure makes possible, is what forgetting provides, is what some people need in order to live. And the living is what matters, is what should be protected, is what justifies the technology, justifies the intervention, justifies the choice to erase, to forget, to let go of the past, to be freed from memory, to be given the mercy of amnesia. And the mercy is real, is powerful, is the gift of forgetting what should never have happened, what should never have been remembered, what should never have been allowed to destroy a life. And the destruction is what erasure prevents, is what forgetting stops, is what makes the ethics clear, makes the choice obvious, makes the answer yes. Some memories should be erased, should be deleted, should be forgotten, because memory is not always gift, is sometimes curse, is sometimes the thing that destroys rather than preserves, that harms rather than helps, that makes life unbearable rather than meaningful. And when memory is cursed, then erasure is cure, is treatment, is the ethical response to suffering that has no other solution. and the solution is forgetting, is amnesia, is the right to oblivion, is the choice to let the past go, to be freed from its weight, to live without the burden of memories that serve no purpose except to create pain. And the pain is enough, is reason enough, is justification enough for erasure, for deletion, for the technology that makes forgetting possible, that makes mercy achievable, that makes liberation from memory real. And the real is what matters, is what should guide ethics, is what should determine whether erasure is used, and the determination is clear, is obvious, is yes, for those who need it, for those who are suffering, for those whose memories are destroying them. Erasure should be available, should be offered, should be used, because memory is not sacred, suffering is not meaningful. The past is not worth preserving when it destroys the present, and the present is all there is all that matters, is what should be protected, even if protection requires forgetting, even if survival requires erasure, even if living requires the deletion of memory, because living is what matters, is what ethics serves, is what makes erasure not just permissible, but necessary, not just acceptable, but obligatory, not just an option, but the right choice, the ethical choice, the compassionate choice, the choice that prioritizes people over principles, individuals over ideals, actual lives over abstract concerns. And the concerns are real, but are secondary, are less important than the suffering, less urgent than the need, less compelling than the possibility of relief. And the relief is what erasure provides, is what forgetting offers, is what amnesia delivers, and the delivery is mercy, is compassion, is ethics in action, is the appropriate response to suffering that can be prevented, to pain that can be stopped, to memories that can be erased, and should be erased, and will be erased, because the technology exists, because the need is real, because the suffering is unbearable, and the unbearable should not be borne when it can be lifted, when it can be removed, when it can be erased. And the erasing is not loss but gain, not harm but healing, not destruction but salvation, not the end of identity but its continuation. Because identity requires life, and life requires that memory not be weapon, not be prison, not be torture. And when memory is these things, then erasure is the answer, is the solution, is the mercy that makes living possible, and the possible is what matters, is what ethics serves, is what makes forgetting not failure but wisdom, not weakness but strength, not escape but survival. And survival is enough, is sufficient, is the justification for erasure, for deletion, for the right to forget, for the mercy of amnesia, for the ethics of forgetting. Meaning was not invented but was given, was not constructed but was inherited, was not the product of individual reflection but was the air that was breathed, the framework that was absorbed, the structure that made sense of suffering, of labour, of death, of everything that otherwise would be unbearable. And this given meaning came from stories, from gods, from hierarchies that extended beyond the human into the cosmic, into realms where purposes were assigned, where roles were fixed, where every life, no matter how small, had significance, because it was part of a larger pattern, a divine plan, a cosmic order that justified suffering, that explained inequality, that made death not an end, but a transition. And the transition was to something, was leading somewhere, was part of a narrative that continued beyond the visible, beyond the mortal, beyond the contingent facts of this world, into eternal truths that grounded everything. And the grounding is what modernity has lost, is what the Enlightenment destroyed, is what science dissolved by showing that the cosmic order was projection, was fiction, was the human need for meaning imposed onto a universe that has no meaning, that cares nothing for human purposes, that operates according to laws that are indifferent to whether anyone suffers or flourishes. And the indifference is what modern consciousness must confront, must live with, must somehow survive, and the survival is difficult, is producing the crisis that thinkers have been naming for centuries. The meaning crisis, the disenchantment, the death of God that Nietzsche announced not as celebration, but as diagnosis, as the recognition that the framework had collapsed, that the stories no longer worked, that the gods were no longer believable. And the unbelievability was not failure of faith, but was the inevitable result of knowledge, of the scientific worldview that explained through mechanism what had been explained through purpose, that showed causes where there had been reasons, that revealed the universe to be vast and old and empty of anything like human meaning. And the emptiness is what modern consciousness inherits, is the vacuum that religion once filled, is the absence that creates the crisis, because humans need meaning, are built to seek it, are suffering without it, are experiencing the pointlessness as pathology, as depression, as the epidemic of despair that characterizes wealthy secular societies, where material needs are met but existential needs are not, where comfort is abundant but purpose is absent, where life is long but feels empty, and the emptiness is not new, but the awareness of it is new, is the result of losing the stories that made the emptiness tolerable, that covered it over, that provided the illusion of significance. An illusion is what the religious frameworks were. But they were functional illusions, were useful fictions, were false but necessary. And the necessity is what modernity has trouble acknowledging, has trouble accepting, because modernity is committed to truth, to science, to the rejection of comfortable lies, but the rejection has costs, is leaving people without the resources to make sense of existence, without the narratives that make suffering meaningful, without the structures that provide purpose. And purpose cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual will, cannot be generated by deciding to care about something, because caring requires reasons, and reasons require frameworks, and frameworks are inherited, not invented, are received, not constructed, are given by cultures, by traditions, by the accumulated wisdom of generations who faced the same emptiness and created stories to fill it. And the stories worked not because they were true, but because they were shared, were collective, were providing roles and meanings that were recognized by others, that were part of a social world where purpose was public, was confirmed, was real in the way that social facts are real. And social facts require agreement, require participation, require that people act as if the meaning is there, and the as if is what modernity has trouble with, is what secular consciousness resists, because acting as if seems like pretending, seems like bad faith, seems like the self-deception that Sartre warned against. And so modern individuals are caught between the need for meaning and the inability to believe in the sources of meaning, between the hunger for purpose and the knowledge that purpose is not inherent but is imposed, is constructed, is chosen. And chosen meaning feels arbitrary, feels thin, feels like it could be otherwise, and therefore feels like it is not really meaning at all, but is just preference, just a subjective valuing that has no grounding, no justification, no claim to be anything more than personal taste. And taste is not enough, is not providing the weight that meaning requires, is not making life feel significant, is not answering the question of why any of this matters. And the why is the question that modernity cannot answer, is the question that haunts secular consciousness, is the question that produces the crisis. And the crisis is not just intellectual, but is visceral, is felt, is experienced as the flatness of existence, as the sense that nothing really matters, that everything is permitted because nothing is forbidden, that values are just opinions, and opinions are just brain states, and brain states are just physics. And the physics is indifferent, is not caring, is not providing any reason to do anything, to be anything, to continue existing. And the continuing is what becomes questionable, is what the meaning crisis threatens, is why suicide rates rise, why despair spreads, why affluent societies are seeing increases in deaths of despair, in overdoses, in suicides, in all the ways that people exit when existence feels unbearable. And the unbearable is not material, but is existential, is not about lacking things, but about lacking reasons, lacking purposes, lacking the framework that makes effort meaningful, that makes suffering tolerable, that makes life worth living. And the worth is what is missing, is what cannot be found, is what modernity has destroyed without replacing. And the replacements that have been tried are failing, are not working, are revealing themselves to be inadequate substitutes for what was lost. And what was lost was not just belief in God, but was the entire worldview that made God plausible, that made divine purpose conceivable, that made cosmic meaning possible. And the possible is what has been eliminated, is what science has shown to be projection, to be anthropomorphism, to be the mistaken attribution of human qualities to the universe. And the mistake is understandable, is natural, is the way that consciousness makes sense of the world. But it is still mistake, is still error, is still something that cannot be sustained once knowledge advances, once the mechanisms are understood, once the causes are revealed and the revealing is irreversible, is not allowing return to innocence, is not permitting the restoration of belief, is creating the permanent condition of disenchantment, of knowing that the meanings are not discovered but are created, are not inherent but are imposed, and the imposed cannot carry the weight that the discovered could carry, cannot provide the grounding that the inherent provided, cannot make life feel significant in the way that cosmic purpose made it feel significant. And so modernity is searching, is trying to find secular substitutes, is trying to create meanings that do not depend on the supernatural, on the transcendent, on the stories that are no longer believable. And the substitutes that are tried are varied, are including humanism, the belief that human values are sufficient, that human flourishing is purpose enough, that making life better for people is meaning enough. But humanism is thin, is not providing the depth that religious meaning provided, is not explaining why human flourishing matters, is not grounding value in anything beyond human preference. And preference is not enough, is not answering the question of why this preference rather than another. Why care about flourishing rather than about something else? And the something else is always available, is always an option. And without grounding, the choice feels arbitrary, feels like it could be different. And what can be different feels less real, less binding, less meaningful. And so humanism satisfies some, but not others, works for those who do not need deep grounding, but does not work for those who do, who need reasons that extend beyond the human, beyond the contingent, beyond the arbitrary. And these people are searching, are trying other substitutes, are trying nationalism, the belief that the nation provides purpose, that serving the collective gives life meaning, that sacrifice for the group is the answer. But nationalism is dangerous, is leading to conflict, is producing the us versus them that justifies violence, that makes the other into enemy, that converts the search for meaning into the justification for harm. And the harm is what makes nationalism unsustainable, as meaning is what reveals it to be destructive, to be the kind of substitute that is worse than the absence it is trying to fill. And so nationalism is rejected by many, is seen as the wrong answer, but the rejection leaves the question open, leaves the search continuing. And another substitute that is tried is ideology, the belief that political movements provide purpose, that working for justice or equality or liberation gives life meaning. That commitment to the cause is the answer, and for some this works, is providing the structure that was lost, is giving roles and purposes, and the sense of being part of something larger, something important, something that justifies effort and sacrifice. But ideology is also dangerous, is also producing conflict, is also dividing the world into believers and heretics, is creating the certainty that is intolerant, that is unwilling to coexist with doubt. And the doubt is what ideology cannot tolerate, is what it must suppress. And the suppression is violence, is coercion, is the same problem that religion had, that any totalizing meaning system has. which is that it cannot allow alternatives, cannot permit questioning, cannot coexist with the plurality that modernity also values, and so ideology is failing as substitute, is producing as much harm as good, is not solving the meaning crisis, but is creating new problems, new conflicts, new reasons for despair, and the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes modern consciousness, when all the substitutes are tried and found wanting, when the search for meaning exhausts itself, when the recognition arrives that maybe meaning cannot be found, cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual or collective will, because meaning was never something that humans made, but was something they received, was given by frameworks that emerged over centuries, that were refined through generations, that worked because they were inherited, not because they were chosen, and choosing meaning is the modern problem, is the thing that modernity demands, but that consciousness cannot do, because choice requires reasons, and reasons require grounding, and grounding is what is missing, is what was lost with the death of God, with the collapse of cosmic purpose, with the recognition that the universe is indifferent, and the indifference is the truth, is what science reveals, is what honesty requires accepting, and the acceptance is what some philosophers advocate, is what Camus called absurdism, is the response that acknowledges the meaninglessness while refusing to be destroyed by it, that confronts the absurd without fleeing into suicide or into false hope, that lives with full awareness of the void while continuing to live, while continuing to act, while continuing to find moments of joy and connection and beauty, even though none of it means anything in the cosmic sense. None of it matters beyond the moment, none of it will be remembered once consciousness ends, and the ending is inevitable, is coming for everyone, is the final proof that nothing matters, that all effort is futile, that existence is temporary and meaning is impossible. And yet the absurd response is to continue anyway, is to rebel against the meaninglessness, not by denying it, but by living in spite of it, by affirming life without justification, by finding satisfaction in the act of living itself rather than in any purpose that living serves. And the serving is what is abandoned, is what the absurd lets go of, is what is recognized as impossible. And the impossible is what modernity must accept, must live with, must somehow survive, and the survival is not guaranteed, is not easy, is requiring a transformation of consciousness, a new way of being human that does not need cosmic meaning, that does not require divine purpose, that can tolerate the void without filling it, that can live with the knowledge that existence is contingent, that meaning is constructed, that everything could be otherwise. And the otherwise is what makes nothing necessary, nothing absolute, nothing secure, and the insecurity is the permanent condition, is what modernity offers, is what the horizon of meaning looks like when the horizon keeps receding, when the destination is revealed to be illusion, when the search is recognized as endless because there is nothing to find, no meaning to discover, no purpose to uncover, only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence of the universe that does not answer, that does not care, that does not provide what humans need. And the need is real, is not going away, is producing the crisis that may not have solution, that may be the permanent condition of secular consciousness, of enlightened awareness, of the knowledge that liberates from illusion, but enslaves to despair. And the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes the horizon of meaning in modernity, the flat landscape where purposes used to stand, where gods used to reign, where cosmic order used to justify suffering, and now there is nothing, or there is only what can be constructed, what can be chosen, what can be performed, and the performance feels hollow, feels fake, feels like going through motions, without conviction, and conviction is what is missing, is what cannot be manufactured, is what made religious meaning work, and without it the secular substitutes fail. The humanisms and nationalisms and ideologies all fail because they lack the weight, lack the depth, lack the grounding that conviction requires, and the requires is what consciousness needs, is what makes meaning meaning rather than just preference. And preference is not enough, has never been enough, will never be enough, because humans are built for meaning, are requiring it, are suffering without it. And the suffering is the crisis, is the modern condition, is the permanent state of existence at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon is empty, is revealing nothing, is offering nothing except the recognition that meaning was always illusion, was always projection, was always the human need imposed onto a universe that provides nothing, that offers nothing, that is indifferent to whether anyone finds meaning or drowns in meaninglessness. And the drowning is happening, is visible, is the epidemic of despair, is the meaning crisis that modernity cannot solve, because the solution would require believing what cannot be believed, accepting what knowledge has revealed to be false, returning to illusions that have been seen through. And the seeing through is irreversible, is permanent, is leaving consciousness stranded at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon extends forever and reveals nothing, where the search continues because it must, but where nothing is found because nothing is there, because meaning is not discovered but was always created, was always the story that consciousness told itself, and the story has ended, has been revealed as story. And what remains is the silence, the emptiness, the void that religions were covering, that purposes were filling, that cosmic orders were organizing, and the organizing is gone, is lost, is leaving consciousness alone with existence, with the fact of being without the reason for being, with life without purpose, with experience without significance. And the without is the horizon, is what modernity sees when it looks for meaning. And the looking continues, must continue, because consciousness cannot stop seeking what it needs. But the seeking finds nothing, reveals nothing, discovers nothing except the fact that there is nothing to discover, that the horizon is empty, that meaning is absent, that purpose is impossible, and the impossible is what must be lived with, must be endured, must be survived, and the survival is what absurdism attempts, what Camus offered, what some find sufficient, but many do not, many cannot. Many are destroyed by the emptiness, by the meaninglessness, by the recognition that nothing matters and nothing can be done to make it matter. And the cannot is the tragedy, is the modern condition, is the permanent crisis at the horizon of meaning, where meaning has ended, where purpose has collapsed, where existence continues but significance does not. And the does not is what remains, is what persists, is what characterizes life at the horizon, where the horizon is empty, where the search reveals nothing, where consciousness is alone with its need for meaning in a universe that provides none, that offers none, that will never provide any, because meaning is not there, was never there, is only here in consciousness, in the stories that are told, in the illusions that are maintained, and the maintaining is what modernity cannot do, is what knowledge prevents, is what honesty forbids, and so the crisis continues, the despair persists, the horizon remains empty, and consciousness must somehow survive, must somehow continue, must somehow live without meaning, without purpose, without the grounding that makes existence bearable, and the bearable becomes questionable, becomes doubtful, becomes the thing that many cannot achieve, and the achieving is the challenge, is the task, is what modernity demands without providing resources, without offering solutions, without giving answers, because there are no answers, there is no solution, there is only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence, and the silence is what speaks, is what reveals, is what remains at the horizon of meaning where meaning has ended, and nothing has replaced it, and nothing ever will. Time feels like a river flowing in one direction, from past through present toward future, and this feeling is so fundamental to human experience that questioning it seems absurd, seems like denying gravity or claiming water flows upward. But the feeling of time's flow is not a direct perception of reality, but a construction, a story. The brain tells about the relationship between events. And when physicists examine the universe at its most fundamental level, they find no flow, no arrow, no distinction between past and future written into the equations, find only a four-dimensional block where all moments exist simultaneously, where what humans call past and what they call future are just directions in space-time no different than up and down. And this creates a profound puzzle, a gap between how time appears in experience and how it exists in reality, between the subjective sense of moving through time and the objective structure that contains no movement, only arrangement, only the geometry of causation. And this gap suggests that the experience of time is not a feature of the universe, but a feature of consciousness. Not something discovered, but something manufactured. And understanding how this manufacturing happens, how the brain constructs the illusion of flow from raw sensory data and memory and anticipation, reveals something strange about what humans are, about how awareness works, about the mechanisms that create the sense of being a continuous self moving through a series of moments, rather than what might actually be the case, which is that there is no continuous self, and there are no discrete moments, but only patterns of neural activity that interpret themselves as experiencing time, when really they are just responding to change, just processing difference, just comparing present states with stored representations of past states, and calling that comparison memory, calling that experience history, calling that sensation the passage of time. But the passage is metaphor, is language, trying to capture something that has no literal motion, no actual flow, because nothing is passing, nothing is moving. There is only the fact of change, the fact that one configuration of matter gives way to another configuration, and the brain, being a system that persists across configurations, that maintains some continuity of structure, even as its content shifts, interprets this persistence as duration, as a self that endures, as an identity that travels from then to now. But the travelling is illusion. The self at each moment is different from the self at every other moment, shares some patterns, some connections, some information, but is not the same thing, is not a substance that moves, but a process that recurs. And what is called the experience of time is really the experience of this process recognizing its own recurrence, noticing that the current pattern resembles previous patterns, that there is continuity even though there is no identity, that memory creates the appearance of a past that the present self once inhabited, when really the past exists only as traces, as modifications to neural structure, as information encoded in synaptic weights. And these traces are not recordings, are not faithful representations, are reconstructions, are guesses about what must have happened based on fragmentary evidence. And every time a memory is recalled, it is reconstructed slightly differently, is altered by the present context, by current beliefs, by subsequent experiences, and so the past is not fixed, is not a stable foundation upon which the present stands, but is constantly being rewritten, constantly being adjusted to fit the story. The brain is telling about who it is and how it got here, and this means that personal history is fiction, not in the sense of being deliberately false, but in the sense of being narrative, being shaped by the requirements of coherence and meaning, rather than by pure correspondence to what actually occurred. And what actually occurred is anyway inaccessible, is gone, exists only in the present, in the form of these unreliable traces that claim to point backward, but really only point to themselves, only demonstrate that something happened without being able to show exactly what. And the brain fills in the gaps, invents details, smooths over inconsistencies, creates a past that makes sense of the present, even if that past never happened quite the way it is remembered. And people are completely unaware of this invention, completely convinced that memory is retrieval, that remembering is like playing back a recording, when really It is more like improvising a story based on a few key words, more like confabulation than documentation, and the implications are vertiginous because if the past is unreliable, then what is the present based on? What is the foundation of identity? If history is malleable, what does it mean to be the same person over time if the time itself is constructed and the person at each moment is different and the memories connecting them are fabricated? And perhaps the answer is that there is no foundation, no solid ground, no identity in the sense of something that persists unchanged, only the process of identification, the act of claiming continuity, the narrative that says, I am the one who did that, who experienced this, who will do something else tomorrow. And this narrative is not true or false, but functional, is a tool the brain uses to coordinate behavior across time, to plan, to learn, to maintain social relationships. Because others expect continuity, expect that the person they met yesterday will be recognizably the same person today. And so the brain provides that continuity, constructs that sameness, even though at the level of neurons and molecules, there is constant flux, constant replacement, constant change. Henri Bergson argued that there are two kinds of time, clock time and lived time, the abstract mathematical time of physics that divides duration into discrete instants, measurable and uniform, and the qualitative time of consciousness that cannot be divided, that is not made of moments, but is a continuous flow, an indivisible duration where past and present interpenetrate, where memory is not storage but preservation, where the whole of experience is always present, always accessible, not as separate events but as a cumulative whole. And Bergson called this duration, and he believed that science, by spatializing time, by treating it as if it were a line made of points, misses what time actually is in lived experience, misses the flow, the thickness, the way that consciousness is always multiple, always containing more than the present instant, always reaching backward into memory and forward into anticipation. And this multiplicity is what gives experience its richness, its texture, is what makes a melody more than a sequence of individual notes. Because the melody is heard as a whole, as a pattern that emerges from the relationship between notes rather than from the notes themselves. And this pattern exists only in duration, only in the continuous present that holds the past notes in memory while the current note is sounding. And without this duration, there would be no music, no meaning, no connection between moments, just isolated sensations with no relationship. And Bergson believed that the brain does not produce consciousness but limits it, filters it, reduces the totality of duration to the narrow slice that is relevant for action, for survival, for navigating the practical demands of living in a body. And what is called the present moment is really just this filtered slice, this pragmatic selection from the fullness of time and different states of consciousness. Different drugs, different practices can alter the filter, can expand the present, can make it thicker or thinner, can change how much of the past is felt to be co-present with the now. And this variability shows that the present is not a fixed instant, but a flexible window, a span that can be adjusted, and what determines the adjustment is not the external world, but the internal state. The brain's current configuration, its chemical balance, its attentional focus. And so the experience of time is not a passive registration of external temporal facts, but an active construction that varies with the observer, that is different for different species, different for different individuals, different even for the same individual in different circumstances. And this relativity of subjective time is separate from the relativity of physics, is about consciousness rather than space-time, is about how duration is experienced rather than how it is measured. And Bergson thought that science could never capture this experiential dimension, could never reduce durée to equations, because equations deal with space, and time deals with change, with becoming, with something that is not spatial and cannot be spatialized without losing its essential character. And whether Bergson was right about this is debatable. Neuroscience has made significant progress in understanding how the brain constructs temporal experience, has identified mechanisms involved in time perception, in the binding of events into sequences, in the calibration of subjective duration. But whether this understanding captures what Bergson meant by durée, whether it explains the qualitative feel of time passing, is less clear, is perhaps another instance of the explanatory gap, the hard problem of consciousness applied to temporality. The question of why there is something it is like to experience duration, rather than time just being a parameter in neural computations without any felt quality, without any phenomenology. The specious present, a term coined by William James, refers to the fact that what is experienced as now is not an instantaneous point, but a short interval, usually estimated at around 2 to 3 seconds, within which events feel simultaneous, feel co-present, and this interval is necessary for perception to work. Because if the present were truly instantaneous, if it had no duration, then there could be no perception of motion, no perception of change, no perception of anything except static snapshots, with no connection between them. And so the brain creates a window, a moving window that slides along the timeline, integrating information from the immediate past with information from the present instant. And within this window, there is no sense of before and after. Everything feels like it is happening now. And only when events fall outside the window do they become past, become memory, rather than perception. And the edges of this window are not sharp, are not clearly defined. There is a gradient where the recent past fades into history, and the immediate future emerges into anticipation. And this fuzziness is why temporal order judgments are difficult, why people often cannot tell which of two closely spaced events occurred first, why the subjective sequence of events can differ from the objective sequence. And experiments show that the brain does not perceive events in the order they occur, but reorders them, retrospectively constructs a sequence that makes sense, that fits with expectations, that creates a coherent narrative. And this reordering can be demonstrated by showing people visual and auditory stimuli in close succession and asking them to judge which came first. And the answers are inconsistent, vary depending on attention, on prior exposure, on the semantic relationship between the stimuli. And what this shows is that temporal order is not given but inferred, is a conclusion the brain arrives at rather than a fact it registers. And the brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy, prefers a meaningful sequence to a faithful sequence. And this preference is not conscious, is not deliberate, is built into the perceptual mechanisms that construct experience. And so what is lived is not what happened, but what the brain decides happened. What fits the story? What makes sense in retrospect? And retrospect is the only perspective available, because by the time an event is experienced, it is already past, is already memory. The neural processing takes time. The signal has to travel from sense organs to cortex, has to be integrated, interpreted, bound into a unified percept. And all of this happens in the past, in the few hundred milliseconds before the event enters awareness. And so consciousness is always behind, always lagging, always commenting on what has already occurred. And the sense of being present, of experiencing now, is an illusion created by the brain, backdating its own representations, stamping them with a time signature that says this is happening now, when really it happened a moment ago. And the moment ago is imperceptible, is hidden by the smoothness of the construction, by the fact that the lag is constant and so feels like zero, feels like immediacy, when really there is a gap, a delay, a space between occurrence and awareness that is filled by processing, by the mechanisms that turn raw sensation into coherent experience. And within this gap, anything can happen. Any reordering, any editing, any adjustment that makes the story work. And there is no way to catch the brain in the act. No way to compare the experience to the reality because the experience is the only access to reality, is the only data available. And so the illusion is perfect, is undetectable from within, can only be inferred from indirect evidence, from experiments that catch the brain making mistakes, from situations where the constructed sequence contradicts the known sequence, and these situations are rare, require careful setup, because most of the time the construction is accurate enough, is close enough to the actual order of events, that no discrepancy is noticed, no problem arises, and this is what the mechanisms are optimized for. Not perfect accuracy, but sufficient accuracy, good enough to navigate the world, to avoid predators, to catch prey, to coordinate action with perception. And beyond that threshold, there is no selective pressure, no reason for the system to be more precise, and so it is not. And the sloppiness is revealed only in edge cases, only when looked for, only when the philosopher or the neuroscientist designs experiments to probe the boundaries of temporal perception and discovers that the boundaries are not where common sense suggests they should be. Memory is not storage but transformation, not preservation but reconstruction, and every act of remembering changes what is remembered, alters the trace, modifies the engram, and this modification is not corruption, is not failure, is the way memory is supposed to work, because the function of memory is not to record the past but to inform the future, to extract patterns from experience that will be useful later, to generalize, to abstract, to create rules and heuristics that apply across situations. And this requires flexibility, requires that memories be updated when new information arrives, when context changes, when the significance of an event is reinterpreted in light of subsequent experience. And so memory is always current, is always reflecting the present state of understanding. And this is why eyewitness testimony is unreliable, why people can be completely confident in memories that are completely false, why families argue about what happened because each member remembers it differently, and each is certain their version is correct, and all of them are wrong. All of them are remembering not the event, but the last time they remembered the event, and each remembering leaves a new trace, slightly different from the previous trace, and over time the memory drifts, diverges from what actually happened, and there is no original to compare it to, no master copy that remains unchanged. The first encoding is itself an interpretation, is already shaped by attention, by expectation, by emotion, by all the factors that determine what gets noticed and what gets ignored. And so from the beginning, memory is selective, is partial, is biased, and every subsequent recall adds another layer of bias, another round of reconstruction. And what remains after years is often more fiction than fact, is a story that has been told and retold so many times that it has taken on a life of its own, has become part of identity, part of the narrative of who I am and where I came from. And this narrative is precious, is defended against contradiction, is maintained even in the face of evidence, because it is not just information, is not just data, is meaning, is the framework through which life makes sense, and threatening the memory is threatening the self, is suggesting that the person is not who they think they are, that the past they rely on is unreliable. And most people cannot tolerate this suggestion, reject it, become angry, double down on their version. And this rigidity is not stubbornness, but self-protection, is the mind defending its coherence, maintaining its integrity against fragmenting forces, and the alternative, accepting that memory is unreliable, that the past is uncertain, that identity is built on sand, is too destabilizing for most, is a kind of epistemological vertigo that threatens to dissolve the ground beneath everything. And so the illusion is maintained, the confidence is preserved, the memory is trusted even though it should not be. And life continues on this foundation of useful fictions, of pragmatic falsehoods, of stories that are not true but are necessary. And perhaps truth is not the right criterion. Perhaps what matters is not whether the memory corresponds to what happened, but whether it serves the present, whether it helps navigate current challenges, whether it contributes to functioning. And by that standard, most memories are good enough, are functional, even if they are not accurate, even if they are inventions, even if the past they depict never existed except in the retrospective construction that claims to be reporting it. And this is the deepest illusion of time, not that it flows or that the present is specious or that duration is constructed, but that there is a past at all, that history is something that happened rather than something that is happening now, in the present, in the act of remembering, in the process of telling the story. And the past that is remembered is not behind, is not earlier, is right here, is present, is part of the current configuration of neural states. And saying it is past is just a way of talking about certain kinds of present states, the ones that claim to refer to earlier configurations. But the earlier configurations are gone, do not exist, cannot be accessed, and what remains is only the claim, only the reference, only the trace that says, this is a memory, this is about then, but the saying is happening now, is present. And so the past collapses into the present, is revealed to be a mode of present experience rather than a separate domain. And if the past is present, then the future is too, is also a mode of current experience. The anticipation, the planning, the fear and hope and expectation that constitute futurity, and these are present states as well, are neural activity happening now, that interprets itself as being about later, but the later never comes, never is experienced, because when it arrives it is now, is present, and the present is all there ever is the only time that exists, and the flow of time from past through present to future is a story told within the eternal now, is a way of organizing experience, of making sense of change, of creating narrative continuity across discontinuous moments. But the moments are not discontinuous, are not separate, because separation requires time. And time is what is being constructed, is the product, not the container, is what emerges from the activity of brains, not what brains exist within. And this inversion, this recognition that time is inside rather than outside, that temporality is a feature of consciousness rather than a feature of the universe, changes everything, makes the question not what time is but how time is made, not when things happen, but how happening is experienced, not whether the past is real, but what reality means when applied to something that exists only as a present claim about a vanished state. And these questions have no final answers, have only perspectives, only frameworks, only ways of talking that are more or less useful depending on context, depending on purpose. And the illusion of linear time is useful, is necessary for planning, for learning, for maintaining the fiction of personal identity that makes social life possible. But it is still illusion, is still construction, is still something the brain does rather than something the brain discovers. And knowing this does not make the illusion disappear, does not make time stop feeling like it flows, because the feeling is built in, is automatic, is not subject to voluntary control, but the knowing changes the relationship to the feeling, creates distance, creates perspective, makes it possible to see the machinery at work, to recognize that what feels like the fundamental structure of reality is actually the fundamental structure of experience. And experience is not reality, but a model of reality, a map, not the territory, a useful approximation that is wrong in systematic ways. And the wrongness matters when the goal is understanding rather than functioning, when the question is what time is rather than how to use it. And these questions have occupied philosophers for millennia, have generated countless theories, countless arguments, and none have settled the matter because the matter is not empirical, is not something that can be resolved by more data or better experiments, is conceptual, is about what categories to use, what framework to adopt, what language game to play, and different games give different answers. And there is no metagame from which to judge which game is correct. Only pragmatic considerations, only questions about which framework is most useful, for which purposes. and for most purposes the folk framework is sufficient. The common sense view that time flows and the past is real, and memory is retrieval, and only when that framework breaks down, only when the contradictions become too obvious or the questions become too fundamental, is there reason to look for alternatives? To consider that maybe time does not flow, maybe the past is not real, maybe memory is not retrieval. And these maybes are not conclusions but invitations, not statements of fact but suggestions to look again, to question the obvious, to doubt the immediate, to recognize that the illusion of linear time is so convincing precisely because it is illusion, because it's made to be convincing, because that is its function, and seeing through it does not require rejecting it, does not require abandoning temporal language or pretending that past and future do not exist, only requires holding them lightly, provisionally, as useful fictions rather than ultimate truths, as tools rather than discoveries, as constructions rather than constraints. And in that lightness there is freedom. Not freedom from time, but freedom within it. Freedom to recognize that the experience is made, is chosen in some sense, even if not consciously. And what is made can be remade. What is chosen can be chosen differently. And the architecture of temporal experience, while deeply ingrained, while largely automatic, is not completely fixed, can be altered through practice, through attention, through deliberate cultivation of different modes of awareness. And these alterations do not reveal the true nature of time, but reveal that there is no true nature, no fact of the matter, only different ways of experiencing, different ways of constructing, different ways of being temporal creatures in a universe that may not be temporal at all, that may be timeless, eternal, a block, where all moments exist at once and the flow is purely in the eye of the beholder, in the structure of consciousness that moves through the block, not because the block is moving, but because consciousness is change, is process, is the activity of comparing states and calling that comparison time. And if this is right, then time is mind-dependent, is subjective in a radical sense, is not something that would exist without observers to construct it. And the universe before consciousness, before brains, was not a universe in time, but a universe of timeless physical states, of mathematical relationships, of geometry without duration, and only when matter organized itself into patterns that could represent their own history, that could compare past states with present states, did time emerge. Did temporality become a feature of the world? Not of the physical world, but of the phenomenal world. The world is experienced, and this emergence is recent, is evolutionary. Recent is less than 1 billion years old in a universe that is 14 billion years old. And for most of the universe's history, there was no time, no flow, no past or future, just configurations of matter energy, obeying laws that contain no temporal asymmetry, no preferred direction. And even now, time exists only locally, only in the small pockets of the universe, where consciousness has emerged, where nervous systems have evolved the capacity to construct temporal narratives. And the rest of the universe remains timeless, remains a four-dimensional block. And what is called the flow of time is the motion of awareness through that block. And the motion is not in the block, but in the awareness. Is a property of minds, not of space-time. And this might be the final truth about time, that it is ours, that we made it, that the illusion of linear time is not an illusion of time, but the creation of time, the bringing into being of something that would not otherwise exist. And in that creation, there is something profound, something that makes consciousness significant, not because it reveals the world, but because it transforms the world, adds temporality to what was timeless, adds meaning to what was bare fact, adds story to what was merely structure. And whether this addition is valuable, whether time is something worth creating, is a question each moment must answer for itself, right here in this specious present that claims to be flowing, but is really just being, just the fact of awareness watching itself and calling that watching time. Balancing intuition and theory. There is a method in philosophy that claims to find truth not by discovering foundations, not by building from self-evident axioms, not by appealing to revelation or pure reason, but by seeking coherence, by adjusting beliefs until they fit together, by moving back and forth between particular judgments and general principles until a stable equilibrium is reached. And this method is called reflective equilibrium. And it was developed most fully by John Rawls in his work on justice, though the idea stretches back through the history of philosophy, back to the recognition that neither pure theory nor pure intuition can be trusted alone, that each must constrain and correct the other. That truth emerges from their interaction rather than from either in isolation. The process begins with considered judgments, with the moral intuitions people have about particular cases. Intuitions like slavery is wrong. Promise breaking requires justification. Causing unnecessary suffering is bad. And these intuitions are the raw material, the data that ethical theory must account for. But they are not infallible, not sacrosanct, not immune to revision. They are provisional starting points that might be mistaken, might be the product of bias or prejudice or limited understanding, and the method acknowledges this, acknowledges that intuitions can be wrong while still insisting they are the only place to start, the only access we have to moral reality, because if we do not begin with intuitions, then where do we begin? What other source of moral knowledge is there? And the answer seems to be none. No pure reason that delivers ethical truths, no perception that reveals moral facts, no authority that can be trusted without question. Only the messy collection of judgments people make about cases, judgments that often conflict, that differ across cultures, that change over time, and yet somehow, from this unpromising material, moral philosophy must be constructed. Rawls distinguished between narrow and wide reflective equilibrium. Narrow equilibrium is achieved when particular judgments and general principles are brought into coherence with each other, but nothing else. When the theory fits the intuitions and the intuitions fit the theory, but no attention is paid to alternative theories, to background beliefs, to empirical facts about human nature or social organization. And this is relatively easy to achieve, but not very stable, not very trustworthy, because it might be that another theory fits the intuitions just as well, might be that the intuitions themselves rest on false empirical beliefs, might be that the whole system is coherent but disconnected from reality. A beautiful castle built on sand and wide equilibrium tries to avoid this by expanding the scope of what must cohere, by requiring that the theory fit not just with moral intuitions but with considered beliefs about psychology, about society, about human nature, with alternative moral theories that have been seriously considered and rejected for good reasons. And this makes equilibrium harder to achieve, but more robust, more likely to track truth rather than merely achieve internal consistency, because it forces the theorist to confront challenges, to test the theory against competitors, to ensure that coherence is not just local, but global, not just moral, but includes everything the person believes. But this raises an immediate problem, the problem of whether intuitions are really data, whether they deserve the role Rawls assigns them, whether they are observations of moral reality or merely expressions of cultural conditioning, of evolutionary adaptation, of psychological bias. And if intuitions are not perceptions of moral facts, but products of contingent causal processes, then why should they constrain theory at all? Why not just construct moral theory from scratch using pure reason, using consistency and simplicity and other theoretical virtues, and let the intuitions fall where they may? And some philosophers have argued exactly this, have argued that intuitions are unreliable, that they differ too much across individuals and cultures to be evidence, that they are shaped by factors that have nothing to do with truth, by emotion and self-interest and social pressure. And if this is right, then reflective equilibrium is not a method for discovering moral truth, but for rationalizing prejudice, for systematizing whatever intuitions one happens to have, for building coherent theories that reflect nothing more than the contingent moral psychology of the theorist. Rawls was aware of this objection. He restricted the relevant intuitions to considered judgments made under favourable conditions, when the person is calm and informed and has no personal stake in the outcome, when they are not distracted by irrelevant factors, when they have thought carefully about the case, and this restriction is supposed to filter out the unreliable intuitions, the ones produced by bias or emotion or confusion, and leave only the reliable ones, the ones that are genuinely responsive to moral reality. But critics ask how we know which intuitions are made under favourable conditions, how we distinguish the reliable from the unreliable without already having a moral theory. And if we need a theory to identify good intuitions, then we cannot use intuitions to build the theory. We are reasoning in a circle, using theory to select data and data to support theory. And this circularity seems vicious, seems to undermine the entire method, because it means we can get any result we want just by choosing the right intuitions, by labeling the intuitions that fit our preferred theory as considered judgments, and dismissing the rest as unreliable. And there is no independent check, no way to break into the circle from outside, no neutral standpoint from which to evaluate whether the equilibrium reached tracks truth or merely reflects the prejudices we started with. Goodman faced a similar problem in the philosophy of science with his work on induction. He argued that inductive rules are justified by their conformity to accepted inductive inferences, and accepted inferences are justified by their conformity to rules. And this seems circular in the same way, seems to justify induction by appeal to induction. But Goodman argued the circularity was not vicious but virtuous, that this is how justification works, not by reduction to foundations but by mutual support, by coherence among elements, none of which are independently justified, but which together form a stable system. And Rawls borrowed this idea, applied it to ethics, argued that moral theory is justified the same way, not by derivation from self-evident principles, but by coherence with considered judgments. And just as scientific method is justified by its success in producing reliable predictions and explanations, moral theory is justified by its success in organizing and explaining moral phenomena, in capturing what is right about our intuitions while correcting what is wrong. And this is not circular reasoning, but reflective reasoning, reasoning that loops back on itself, that uses its own outputs as inputs, that gradually refines itself through iteration. And the result is not certainty, but reasonable confidence, not proof, but the best we can do given our epistemic situation, given that we are finite creatures trying to understand domains that exceed our individual capacities. But the analogy to science is controversial because science has a reality check, has observation and experiment, has ways of testing theories against the world that do not depend entirely on coherence. And ethics lacks this, has no moral microscope, no way to observe moral facts independently of intuition. And if intuitions are all we have, then coherence among them is just coherence among beliefs, is not evidence of truth, but only evidence of consistency. And many philosophers have argued that this is not enough, that ethics needs something more than reflective equilibrium, needs some external constraint, some connection to reality that goes beyond mere coherence. And this is where moral realism enters, the view that there are objective moral facts independent of human belief, facts that make moral judgments true or false. And the realist thinks reflective equilibrium might accidentally hit on truth, but cannot guarantee it, cannot ensure that the equilibrium reached corresponds to reality rather than just organizing our prejudices into a coherent system, while the anti-realist thinks there are no moral facts, that all ethics can do is organize intuitions into coherent systems, and reflective equilibrium is the best method available because it is the only method available, because there is nothing beyond coherence to aim for. Singer challenges reflective equilibrium from a different angle. He argues that many widely shared intuitions are simply wrong, are products of speciesism or other biases, and that a good moral theory should reject these intuitions rather than accommodate them, should revise our judgments radically rather than merely refining them. And if Singer is right, then reflective equilibrium is too conservative, too wedded to existing intuitions, too reluctant to overturn established moral beliefs, and the method will never lead to radical moral progress, will never challenge deeply held prejudices, will only produce theories that ratify the status quo with minor modifications. And this seems like a serious problem, because the history of ethics is a history of moral progress, of learning that practices once thought acceptable were actually wrong, of expanding the moral circle to include those previously excluded, and this progress often required rejecting intuitions that seemed obvious to earlier generations, rejecting the intuition that women were inferior, that slavery was natural, that animals had no moral status, and if these intuitions had been treated as data to be preserved in reflective equilibrium, then moral progress would have been impossible. The method would have locked in the prejudices of the age rather than enabling their critique. Rawls responds that reflective equilibrium does allow for revision of intuitions, that the process is not conservative but dialectical, that general principles can lead us to reject particular judgments when they conflict, that the equilibrium reached might be quite distant from the intuitions we started with, and he points to his own theory of justice, which leads to conclusions many people find counterintuitive, which argues for principles that would radically transform existing social arrangements. And this shows that the method does not simply ratify existing beliefs, but can challenge them, can lead to revisionary conclusions, but the question remains whether it can challenge them enough, whether the method is capable of truly radical critique, or whether it is always pulled back toward the mainstream by the weight of established intuitions, by the requirement that theory accommodate at least some of our considered judgments. And if it cannot accommodate any judgments, then what is the point of reflective equilibrium? Why not just do pure moral theory without regard for intuitions? And this is the tension at the heart of the method, the need to respect intuitions while remaining open to revising them, the need to start somewhere while acknowledging that the starting point might be entirely wrong. Parfit distinguished between two kinds of moral theorizing: bottom-up theorizing that starts with intuitions and builds principles to explain them, and top-down theorizing that starts with principles and derives conclusions regardless of whether they match intuitions. And reflective equilibrium is supposed to be neither purely bottom-up nor purely top-down, but a combination, a method that moves in both directions, that uses principles to test intuitions and intuitions to test principles. But in practice, most philosophers lean one way or the other. Some trust intuitions more and will reject theories that conflict with strong intuitions, no matter how elegant the theory, while others trust theory more and will reject intuitions no matter how strong, if the theory implies they're wrong. And this split reflects deeper disagreements about the nature of moral knowledge, about whether ethics is more like perception, where we observe facts, or more like mathematics, where we reason from axioms. And reflective equilibrium tries to split the difference, but might satisfy neither side, might be too rationalist for the intuitionists and too intuitionist for the rationalists, might be a compromise that inherits the weaknesses of both approaches without fully gaining the strengths of either. The theory-ladenness of observation is a problem in science, and an even bigger problem in ethics, because intuitions are not neutral observations, but are shaped by the theories we already hold, by the concepts we use, by the categories we think in, and this means that intuitions cannot serve as independent checks on theory, because they are already contaminated by theory, are already expressions of theoretical commitments rather than raw data. And when we achieve reflective equilibrium between intuitions and theory, We might just be finding coherence between a theory and the intuitions that theory itself generated. We are making the theory consistent with its own implications rather than with independent reality. And this is not a test, not a confirmation, not evidence of truth. It is just circular reasoning dressed up as a method. And the only way to break the circle would be to have theory-neutral intuitions. Intuitions that are not shaped by any theoretical commitments. But such intuitions might not exist, might be impossible, because all judgment requires concepts, and all concepts embody theoretical assumptions, and this means we are trapped inside our conceptual schemes, unable to step outside them to check whether they correspond to reality, unable to do anything but reorganize them into more or less coherent patterns. Neurath's boat is the metaphor often used here. The idea that we are like sailors who must rebuild their ship while at sea, who cannot return to dry dock, who must stand on some planks while replacing others, who can never inspect the whole. Structure at once, but must trust that the parts they are not currently working on are sound enough to support them, and reflective equilibrium is like this, is a process of revising beliefs, while standing on other beliefs, of using some judgments to evaluate others without ever having a belief-free standpoint, without ever achieving the kind of foundation that traditional epistemology sought. And this seems precarious, seems to offer no guarantee of truth, seems to allow for the possibility that the entire system could be coherent but false, that we could achieve perfect equilibrium while being radically wrong about everything. And defenders of the method acknowledge this possibility, but argue it is unavoidable, argue that there is no alternative, that all reasoning is like this, that the demand for foundations is a mistake, that coherence is not a second-best substitute for foundation, but the only kind of justification there is. And we must either accept this or give up on justification entirely, give up on the possibility of distinguishing better from worse beliefs. And this is not acceptable. So we must accept reflective equilibrium, despite its limitations, despite its circularity, despite its inability to guarantee truth. The method has been applied beyond ethics, has been used in epistemology and metaphysics, and even in empirical sciences, wherever there is a need to balance theory and data, wherever neither can be trusted absolutely, wherever truth seems to emerge from coherence rather than correspondence. And this generalization suggests the method captures something deep about human reasoning, something about how finite creatures with limited access to reality must navigate uncertainty, must construct understanding from partial and fallible materials, must accept that justification is always provisional, always subject to revision, always dependent on a network of beliefs that might themselves need revision. And this is not skepticism, not the claim that we cannot know anything, but fallibilism, the claim that we can know things but cannot know them with certainty, cannot eliminate the possibility of error, cannot achieve the kind of absolute justification that philosophers once sought but must settle for something weaker, something more human, something that acknowledges our limitations, while still insisting that some beliefs are better justified than others, that some theories fit the evidence better than others, that coherence matters even if it does not guarantee truth. The psychological research on moral intuitions complicates the picture further, because it shows that intuitions are fast, automatic, emotionally laden judgments that often precede reasoning rather than result from it, that people typically judge first and justify later, that the reasoning we offer for moral judgments is often post hoc rationalization rather than the actual cause of the judgment. And if this is true, then reflective equilibrium is not a description of how moral thinking actually works, but a normative ideal, a recommendation for how it should work. And the question is whether this ideal is achievable, whether people can actually suspend their automatic judgments long enough to engage in the kind of reflective process Rawls describes, whether we can override our intuitions when theory demands it, or whether we are psychologically incapable of this, whether our reasoning is always in service of our intuitions rather than capable of genuinely evaluating them, and if we are psychologically incapable of genuine reflective equilibrium, then the method is not just difficult, but impossible, is an ideal that cannot be realized, and all actual moral theorizing is just rationalization of intuitions that we are stuck with, that we cannot revise no matter how much we reflect. And this would be a devastating conclusion, would suggest that moral philosophy is futile, that it cannot correct our biases because those biases are built into the very process of moral thought. But the research is contested, the interpretation is disputed, and many philosophers remain hopeful that reflection can genuinely revise intuition, that humans are capable of the kind of self-correction that reflective equilibrium requires, even if it is difficult, even if it goes against psychological grain, even if most people, most of the time, fail to achieve it. Putnam sat in a room and imagined two planets, identical in every way, except one, Earth and twin Earth, perfect mirrors of each other, down to the last atom, the last thought, the last whispered word. And on Earth there is water, H2O, the molecule that makes up oceans and rivers and rain. And on twin Earth there is also water, but it is not H2O. It is XYZ, a completely different substance with different chemical structure, different molecular bonds, different properties at the microscopic level. Yet to everyone living on twin Earth it looks exactly like water, tastes exactly like water, behaves exactly like water. It fills their lakes and falls from their clouds and quenches their thirst just as water does on Earth. Now imagine two people, one on Earth and one on twin Earth. Call them both Oscar, and these two Oscars are molecule for molecule identical. Same brain structure, same neural patterns, same memories, same thoughts, same internal psychological states. Everything inside their heads is exactly the same. And both Oscars look at a glass of liquid and say the word water. They both think they are referring to the same thing. They both believe they know what water is, but Putnam asks a simple question that shatters centuries of philosophy. Are they actually referring to the same thing? And the answer is no. Earth Oscar's word water refers to H2O. Twin Earth Oscar's word water refers to XYZ. Same word, same internal mental state, but different meanings, different references, different extensions in the world. And this means that meaning is not determined by what is in the head. Meaning is not a function of internal psychological states. Meaning is not private, not subjective, not locked inside the skull waiting to be discovered through introspection. The tradition, before Putnam, stretching back through Locke and Hume and Descartes, believed that meanings were mental entities, that words were connected to ideas in the mind, that reference was mediated by internal representations, by concepts, by mental images, and if you wanted to know what someone meant by a word, you had to look inside their head, examine their thoughts, map their mental contents, and this made sense, it felt right. It aligned with the intuition that language is personal, that each person has their own private understanding of words, their own associations, their own mental dictionary, but Putnam showed that this entire picture was wrong, that two people could have identical mental contents and still mean different things by the same word. That meaning reaches beyond the skull, beyond the brain, beyond psychology entirely, into the world itself, into the environment, into the physical and social context that determines what words actually refer to. This is semantic externalism, the view that meanings are not in the head but out in the world. That reference is determined not by internal states but by external relations, by causal connections between words and things, by the history of how a word came to be used, by the community of speakers who share the word, by the natural kinds that exist independently of human thought. And this means that you can be wrong about what you mean. You can use a word your entire life and not know what it really refers to. You can have perfect confidence in your understanding and still be completely mistaken, because meaning is not something you possess. It is something you participate in, something that exists in the space between speakers and world, between language and reality, between words and the things they pick out. Putnam's argument did not stop at twin earth. He pushed further. He talked about the division of linguistic labour, the fact that most people do not know the technical details of what their words refer to. Most people cannot define gold in terms of atomic number, cannot distinguish an elm from a beech, cannot explain what makes aluminum different from molybdenum. Yet they use these words successfully. They refer to these things accurately, and they do so not because they have the right mental contents, but because they are embedded in a community where some people do have the expertise, where metallurgists know about aluminum, where botanists know about elms, where chemists know about gold. And when ordinary speakers use these words, they defer to the experts. They rely on the division of labour. They trust that somewhere in the linguistic community, there are people who know what these words really mean, who can distinguish the real thing from the fake. And this trust is what allows language to function, what allows reference to succeed even in the absence of individual knowledge. This overturns the Cartesian picture entirely. Descartes believed that knowledge began with the self, with the contents of consciousness, with what could be known through introspection, and from there one built outward to knowledge of the world. But Putnam showed that the order is reversed, that knowledge of meaning requires knowledge of the world first, that you cannot know what you mean without knowing what your words refer to, and you cannot know what your words refer to just by looking inside your own mind. You have to look outside to the physical environment, to the social context, to the history of usage, to the experts who maintain the standards of reference. And this means that the self is not the foundation of knowledge, but a participant in a larger system, a node in a network of linguistic and social relations that determine meaning collectively, not individually, externally, not internally. Frege tried to solve the problem of meaning differently. He distinguished between sense and reference, between the mode of presentation and the thing presented, and he believed that sense was in the mind, that it mediated reference, that two people could refer to the same thing through different senses, like the morning star and the evening star, both referring to Venus, and this preserved the idea that meaning had a mental component, that internal states mattered. But Putnam's argument cut through this because on twin earth, Oscar and his counterpart have the same sense, the same mode of presentation, the same mental mediation, but they do not have the same reference. They are not talking about the same substance, and this means that sense alone does not determine reference, that no amount of mental content can fix what a word picks out in the world, that reference requires something beyond sense, beyond psychology, beyond anything that can be captured by introspection or phenomenology. Kripke reinforced this from another angle. He argued that names and natural kind terms were rigid designators, that they referred to the same thing in all possible worlds, not by virtue of satisfying a description, but by virtue of causal historical chains, that the word water refers to H2O because it was introduced to refer to a certain substance, and that reference was passed down through generations of speakers, through baptism and transmission, through ostension and use. And even if speakers lost track of what the substance was, even if they forgot its chemical composition, even if they developed false beliefs about it, the words still referred to the same thing, because reference is not determined by beliefs but by the causal connection between word and world, by the chain that links current usage back to the original act of naming, back to the moment when the word was first attached to the thing. This has radical implications for psychology, because it means psychology cannot determine reference, cannot tell you what your words mean, cannot give you the extension of your terms just by examining your mental states. And this was a blow to cognitive science, to theories of mind that tried to explain language purely in terms of internal representations, in terms of concepts and mental models and computational processes, because Putnam and Kripke showed that none of this is enough, That meaning leaks out of the head, that it requires the world, requires the community, requires the causal historical context. And without these external factors, there is no meaning at all. Just empty sounds, just syntax without semantics, just symbols shuffling around inside the skull with no connection to reality. Yet people resist this conclusion. They cling to the intuition that they know what they mean, that their words are transparent to them. That meaning is something they possess and control. And this resistance is understandable because semantic externalism is deeply unsettling. It suggests that we are strangers to our own language, that we do not fully understand the words we speak, that meaning is not something we create, but something we inherit, something we are thrown into, something that precedes us and exceeds us and determines what we can say before we even open our mouths. Wittgenstein saw this too, though from a different direction. He argued that meaning is use, that words get their meaning from the language games they are embedded in, from the forms of life that give them context. And he rejected the idea of private language, the idea that meaning could be purely internal, purely subjective, because a private language would have no standards of correctness, no way to distinguish between following a rule and merely thinking one is following a rule. And without standards, there is no meaning, just the illusion of meaning, just the feeling of understanding without actual understanding. And this is why language must be public, why it must be shared, why it requires a community of speakers who can correct each other, who can point out mistakes, who can maintain the norms that make reference possible. Putnam took this further. He showed not just that language is public, but that meaning is not even fully determined by the community, that it reaches beyond the community into the world itself, that natural kind terms like water and gold and tiger refer to whatever has the same underlying nature as the paradigm samples, the same deep structure, the same essential properties, and this means that meaning can outrun knowledge, that a community can use a word correctly even when they have false beliefs about what they are referring to, even when their theories are wrong, even when their understanding is incomplete, because the word latches onto the real essence, the objective structure, the natural kind that exists independently of human thought. And the world itself constrains meaning, corrects mistakes, determines reference in ways that no internal psychological state can capture. This is why Aristotle was not wrong when he talked about water, even though he did not know about molecules, even though his theory of elements was false. He was still referring to H2O because his word water was causally connected to the same substance our word water refers to, because the reference was fixed not by his beliefs, but by the stuff itself, by the samples he pointed to, by the liquid he drank and swam in and observed, and the continuity of reference across theory change, across conceptual revolutions, across the abandonment of entire frameworks, shows that meaning is anchored in the world, not in the mind, that it survives the death of theories because it was never dependent on theories in the first place. But this raises a puzzle. If meaning is not in the head, if psychological states do not determine reference, then what role does the mind play at all? What is psychology supposed to study if not meaning, if not the contents of thought, if not the representations that mediate between language and world? And Putnam's answer is that psychology studies something real. It studies mental states. It studies computational processes. It studies the functional organization of cognition, but it does not study meaning, because meaning is not a psychological phenomenon. It is a semantic phenomenon. It is a relation between words and world, between signs and reference, between language and reality. And this relation is not mediated by anything in the head. It is direct. It is external. It is constituted by causal and social factors that lie beyond the reach of introspection, beyond the scope of neuroscience, beyond the explanatory power of any psychological theory. Fodor resisted this. He wanted to preserve a role for internal content, for narrow content, for something in the head that could do explanatory work. And he argued that even if meaning is wide, Even if reference is external, there must be something narrow that explains behavior, some internal state that mediates between input and output, some mental representation that the cognitive system manipulates. And he tried to carve out a space for psychology by distinguishing between wide content, which depends on the environment, and narrow content, which does not, which is purely internal, purely psychological, purely computational. But this move was always unstable because narrow content turned out to be elusive, hard to define, hard to individuate, hard to see how it could play the explanatory role Fodor wanted it to play. And many philosophers concluded that narrow content was a myth, that there was no such thing, that all content was wide, that meaning was always externalist, always dependent on factors beyond the head, and if psychology wanted to explain behavior, it would have to appeal to wide content, to states that are individuated by their relations to the environment, to representations that are only representations in virtue of their connections to what they represent. This is deeply counterintuitive because it means that two people in identical internal states could be thinking different thoughts, could be believing different things, could be referring to different objects, just because they are in different environments, just because their words have different causal histories, just because the world around them is structured differently. And this seems to violate the intuition that mental states are internal, that what you're thinking is determined by what is going on inside your head, that consciousness is private, that the contents of experience are immediately accessible to introspection. But Putnam and Kripke showed that this intuition is wrong, that mental states are not self-intimating, that you can be mistaken about what you're thinking, that the meanings of your thoughts depend on facts about the world that you may not know, that reference is opaque, that you can use words successfully without understanding what they mean, that language works not because speakers have perfect knowledge, but because they are embedded in networks of reference that do the work for them, that connect words to things through mechanisms that operate below the level of consciousness, below the level of intentional control. Burge extended this argument to mental content itself. He argued that not just linguistic meaning, but thought itself is individuated externally, that beliefs and desires are identified by their relations to the environment, that you could not have a belief about water if you lived in a world with no water, that mental content is essentially relational, essentially dependent on what exists outside the mind, and this means that the mind is not a self-contained system, not a module that could be studied in isolation, not a computational device that processes inputs according to internal rules, but an open system, a system that is constituted by its interactions with the world, that is shaped by its environment, that cannot be understood without reference to the physical and social context it is embedded in. This has implications for artificial intelligence, for the question of whether machines can think, because if meaning is external, if reference depends on causal historical connections, if mental content is individuated by relations to the environment, then a computer program, no matter how sophisticated, cannot have genuine thoughts unless it has the right connections to the world, unless it is embedded in the right kind of causal network, unless it participates in the same linguistic and social practices that give human words their meanings. And this suggests that thought is not just computation, not just symbol manipulation, not just syntactic operations on formal structures, but something that requires embodiment, requires situatedness, requires participation in a form of life, and a brain in a vat, no matter how complex its internal processes, would not be thinking about water or trees or anything else, because its words would not be connected to anything, would not refer to anything, would be empty symbols with no semantic content, no meaning, no reference, just syntax running in a void. Putnam himself later came to doubt some of his own arguments. He worried that semantic externalism led to metaphysical realism, to the view that there is a fixed, determinate way the world is, independent of human conceptual schemes, independent of language, independent of theory, and he came to think this was incoherent, that it made reference magical, that it required a God's eye view, a perspective from nowhere that could compare words to things without being situated in any particular framework, and he moved toward internal realism, toward the view that truth and reference are always relative to a conceptual scheme, always dependent on the practices and norms of a community, always constrained by what Quine called the tribunal of experience, but never fully determined by it. And this introduced a tension, a pull between the external world that constrains reference and the internal practices that constitute meaning, a tension that Putnam never fully resolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, because meaning lives in that tension, in the space between mind and world, between language and reality, between what we intend and what our words actually pick out. Dennett approached this from yet another angle. He argued that meaning is not a real property, but a useful fiction, that intentional states are not natural kinds, but interpretive stances, that when we attribute beliefs and desires, we are not discovering facts about the mind, but adopting a strategy for predicting behaviour. And from this perspective, the question of whether meaning is in the head or in the world dissolves. Because meaning is not anywhere, it is not a real thing, but a pattern we impose, a way of organising our understanding of complex systems. And the intentional stance works whether we apply it to humans or thermostats or chess programs. The difference is just pragmatic, just a matter of what level of description is most useful for prediction and explanation. Not a matter of what really has meaning and what does not, because nothing really has meaning. Meaning is always an interpretation, always a projection, always a way of seeing that could be otherwise. But this seems too deflationary, too quick to dismiss the felt reality of meaning, the undeniable sense that words do connect to things, that thoughts are about the world. That reference is not just a useful fiction, but a real relation, and even if we cannot fully explain how this relation works, even if semantic externalism leaves gaps and puzzles, it at least takes seriously the intuition that language matters, that what we say makes a difference, that truth is not just coherence within a system, but correspondence with reality, however elusive and problematic that correspondence may be. And to give up on this, to reduce meaning to a mere interpretive stance, feels like giving up on something essential, something worth preserving even if we cannot fully explain it, even if it leads to paradoxes and tensions that resist resolution. Because the alternative is a world where nothing means anything, where language floats free of reality, where thought is cut loose from the world, and that is a world too empty, too barren, too divorced from lived experience to be acceptable, even if it is theoretically cleaner, even if it avoids the hard problems, even if it makes philosophy easier by making meaning disappear. The arrow points the wrong way, points from effect to cause rather than from cause to effect. And this reversal is not metaphor, but is the actual structure of causation, is what the philosopher proved through arguments that were rigorous, that were compelling, that were impossible to refute without abandoning principles that seemed more fundamental than the assumption that time moves forward, and the forward is what everyone believes, is what experience suggests, is what makes narrative possible, what makes agency meaningful, what makes the future open and the past fixed. But the fixed and the open are illusions, are the result of perspective, are artifacts of the way consciousness processes information, and the processing is backward, is receiving effects first and inferring causes later, is experiencing the present as the result of the past when really the present is determining what the past was, is selecting from the quantum superposition of possible pasts the one past that leads to this present. And the leading is backward, is from now to then, is causation in reverse. And reverse is what the philosopher demonstrated, is what the equations required, is what made sense of phenomena that forward causation cannot explain, cannot accommodate, cannot integrate into a coherent framework. And the framework that emerges from a reverse causation is strange, is counterintuitive, is violating every assumption about how time works. But the violations are what the evidence demands, are what quantum mechanics suggests, are what retrocausality makes explicit. And explicit is what the philosopher made the argument that the future affects the past, that outcomes determine antecedents, that the arrow of causation points backward through time. And the backward is not time travel, is not influence across temporal distance, is the structure of time itself, is the geometry of causation, is the way that events relate to each other, not through forward propagation, but through backward determination. And the determination is not free, is not open, is not subject to choice, because choice is an illusion that emerges from not seeing the backward flow, from experiencing effects as if they were not already determined by what comes after. And what comes after is what causes what comes before, is selecting the past from the infinite possibilities, is making history actual through the occurrence of the present. And the present is not the result of the past, but is the cause of the past, is determining which past occurred, which history is real, which antecedents were actual, and the actual is relative, is dependent on the present, is not fixed independently of what happens now, and now is what selects then, is what makes the past what it was, is the causal force that propagates backward, that determines history, that creates the appearance of forward causation by making the past consistent with the present. And the consistency is not temporal but is logical, is the requirement that effects have causes, but the having is backward, is the effect producing the cause, is the present requiring a past that leads to it. And the leading is not temporal propagation, but is logical necessity, is the structure that makes the present intelligible, that makes events cohere, that creates the narrative that seems to flow forward but is really being constructed backward, is being determined by endings rather than by beginnings. And beginnings are not origins, but are consequences, are the results of outcomes, are what must have happened, given what did happen. And the did happen is the present, is the effect, is what determines the cause, and the cause is the past, is what must have been, is what is selected from possibility by actuality, and actuality is now, is the event that is occurring, is the effect that is producing its cause by requiring a history that leads to it. And the leading is logical, is structural, is the way that time is organized, not by forward flow, but by backward determination. And determination is what the future provides, is what outcomes supply, is the force that creates history by making certain pasts actual and other pasts merely possible. And possible is what the past is until the present selects it, until the effect determines the cause, until the outcome requires the antecedent, and the requirement is not temporal but is logical, is the structure of causation that the philosopher proved moves backward, moves from effect to cause, moves from present to past. And the past is not fixed until the present occurs, is not actual until the effect happens, is not real until the outcome determines it. And the determining is continuous, is ongoing, is happening at every moment, as the present selects the past that leads to it as. Effects produce causes, as outcomes create histories, and the histories are not memories but are constructions, are not records but are requirements, are not what happened independently but are what must have happened given what is happening. And the happening is the effect, is the present, is the force that moves backward through time and creates the cause, creates the past, creates the history that seems to precede but really follows, really is determined by, really is the consequence of the present rather than its origin. And the origin is an illusion, is the appearance created by forward perspective, by the experiencing of time as flowing from past to present, when really time is flowing from present to past, is causation moving backward, is effects producing causes, is the future determining the past, and the past is what the future makes it, is what outcomes require it to be, is what is selected from the quantum superposition by the collapse that occurs when the present happens. And the happening is the causal event, is the effect that reaches backward and selects its cause, that determines its antecedent, that creates the history that appears to precede it but really follows it, really is its consequence rather than its origin. And the origin is the end, is the outcome, is the effect that produces the cause. And the producing is backward causation, is retrocausality, is the structure of time that the philosopher proved, that the equations require, that quantum mechanics suggests, and suggests is too weak, because the suggestion is not tentative, but is demanding, is requiring that causation be understood as backward, as moving from effect to cause, as creating the past from the present. And the present is not the result, but is the cause, is not the effect, but is the origin, is not what the past produces, but is what produces the past, and the past is its effect, is its consequence, is what must have been given what is, and what is the present, is the effect that determines the cause, is the outcome that selects the history, is the actuality that makes certain pasts real and leaves others merely possible. And possible is what all pasts are until the present occurs, until the effect happens, until the outcome determines which past is actual, and actual is not independent, is not objective, is not fixed regardless of what happens later, but is relative, is dependent, is determined by what comes after. And what comes after is what causes what comes before, is making the past what it was by being what it is, and being what it is causing what was, is determining history, is selecting from infinite possibilities the one past that leads to this present, and the leading is not temporal but is logical, is the requirement that effects have causes, but the having is backward, is the effect producing the cause, is the present creating the past, is causation in reverse, and reverse is not metaphor but is structure, is the way time actually works, is the geometry of events, is the architecture of causation. And causation is backward, is proven to be backward, is demonstrated through arguments that cannot be refuted without abandoning more fundamental principles. And the principles that are more fundamental are the ones that lead to backward causation, that require retrocausality, that make the future the cause of the past, and the past is the effect of the future, is the consequence of what comes after, is determined by outcomes rather than determining them. And the determining is backward, is from later to earlier, is from effect to cause, and the cause is what the effect produces, is what the outcome requires, is what the present creates. And the creating is continuous, is happening at every moment, is making the past what it is by being what the present is. And the present is not the result of the past, but is the cause of the past, is what makes history actual, is what selects from possibility the one sequence of events that leads to now. And the now is the causal force, is the origin, is what produces the past by requiring it, by making certain antecedents actual and leaving others merely possible. And possible is what the past remains until the present determines it, until the effect selects the cause, until the outcome creates the history. And history is not fixed, is not independent, is not the objective sequence that it appears to be, but is relative, is dependent on the present, is created by what happens now. And now is always creating the past, is always determining history, is always selecting from infinite possibilities the one past that is consistent with this present. And the consistency is not temporal, but is logical, is the requirement that the present makes sense, that effects have causes, that outcomes have antecedents, and the antecedents are determined by the outcomes, are produced by the effects, are created by the present, and the present is the causal force that moves backward, that determines the past, that makes history what it is, and what it is not what it was, but is what it must have been given what is now, and now is what causes then, is what produces the past, is what makes causation move backward, and backward is the direction that the philosopher proved, is the structure that the arguments demonstrate, is the geometry that the equations require, and require is what the present does to the past? Is how effects relate to causes? Is the backward determination that makes sense of phenomena that forward causation cannot explain, cannot accommodate, cannot integrate, and the integration requires backward causation, requires retrocausality, requires that the future affect the past, that outcomes determine antecedents, that effects produce causes, and the producing is backward, is from later to earlier, is making time move in reverse. And reverse is not perception, but is structure, is not how time seems, but is how time is the actual geometry of events, is the real architecture of causation. And causation moves backward, moves from effect to cause, moves from present to past, moves from future to history. And history is determined by future, is produced by outcomes, is created by effects, and effects are causes, are the origins, are what makes the past what it was, and what it was is what the present requires it to have been, is what the effect determines the cause to be, is what the outcome selects from possibility, and possibility is all there is until actuality occurs, until the present happens, until the effect determines the cause, and the determining is backward, is retrocausality, is the structure that the philosopher proved, that the arguments establish, that the evidence demands. And demands is what the present makes of the past, is how effects relate to causes, is the backward determination that makes time move in reverse. And reverse is the direction, is the flow, is the arrow pointing from effect to cause, from present to past, from future to history. And history is effect, is consequence, is result, and result of what? Result of the future, result of what comes after, result of the present that determines what must have come before, and before is after, is consequence, is effect, and effect is cause. When causation moves backward, when time flows in reverse, when the future creates the past and the past is created, is determined, is selected by the present, and the present is the force, is the origin, is the cause that produces the past, and the past is its effect, its consequence, its result. And result is what the past is what history is what yesterday is not the origin of today, but is the effect of today, is what today requires yesterday to have been, is what the present determines the past to be, is what outcomes create as antecedents, and antecedents are consequences, are effects, are results. When causation is backward, when time moves in reverse, when the philosopher is right, and right is what the philosopher proved to be, is what the arguments demonstrate, is what the structure reveals, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that effects produce causes, that the present creates the past, that the future determines history, and history is determined, is not independent, is not fixed, is relative to what comes after, is created by outcomes, is the effect of effects, is the consequence of the present, and the present is the cause, is the origin, is the force that moves backward through time and makes the past what it is. And what it is not what it was, but is what it must be given. What is now, and now causes then, present produces past, effect determines cause, and cause is effect. When time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher is right that time moves backward, that everything is explained by retrocausality, by the future affecting the past, by outcomes determining antecedents, by effects producing causes, and causes are effects of effects, are consequences of consequences, are results of results when causation is backward, when time moves in reverse, when the arrow points from effect to cause, from present to past, from future to history, and history is effect, is consequence, is what the future makes it, is what the present determines it to be, is what outcomes require it to have been, and being is consequence, is result, is effect when time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher proved that time moves backward, and everything is explained by reverse causation, by retrocausality, by the future creating the past, by effects producing causes, by the present determining history, and history is determined, is created, is the effect of the present, and the present is the cause, is the origin, is the force moving backward, making the past, creating history, determining what was, and what was is what the present makes it, is what effects determine causes to be, is what outcomes require antecedents to have been, and been is consequence, is effect, is result. When time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher is right, and right is proven, is demonstrated, is what the arguments show. That time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that the future creates the past, that effects produce causes, that the present determines history, that everything is explained by retrocausality, by backward causation, by time moving in reverse, and reverse is the direction, is the flow, is the truth that the philosopher proved, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that effects cause causes, that the present creates the past, that the future determines history, and history is determined by future, is created by outcomes, is the effect of effects, is the consequence of causation moving backward, and backward is the direction, is the truth, is what the philosopher proved, that time moves backward.